Good afternoon, fellow patriots. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to Patriot Radio, broadcasting live from deep inside the heart of the future Liberty State. Sponsored once again by On Fire Ministries, in the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story and the news behind the news, where it's not about right or left, it's about right and wrong. It's about our hope not being in man, but in Jesus Christ. About not ending in prayer, but moving to action. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Father, deliver us from the evil one.
Welcome to Patriot Radio.
Good afternoon, fellow patriots. And today on Patriot Radio, China does a massive exercise in the South China Sea. Another projection of power. The United States continues preparations for regime change in Venezuela. And a color revolution here in the United States, yes. And we're going to go through what a color revolution is, the color they've already chosen, and what that means for you and I and all God-fearing patriots here in America. And our guest today is going to be Trevor Loudon to talk about Venezuela, the color revolution, and beyond. Here at Patriot Radio, we want you to have the information before everyone else so you and your family be prepared for the times that are ahead and the times that are already upon us. So please follow us on patriotradio.us/Telegram for real-time intelligence analysis and breaking news. And again, we aggregate across so many different things. We're usually half an hour to 2 hours ahead of the mainstream media in analyzing what's really going on and what that means in the next 72 hours, near term. So you're going to want to follow this as things begin to break and shake loose here over the next little while into the holiday season. So you and your family, when you talk about, hey, how did you know that ahead of time? You can talk about Patriot Radio. And more importantly than that, even, you can point them to God. And so if you need prayer over the holiday weekend, or maybe to walk your family through some things, patriotradio.us/prayer is a great place to start. But we also want to make sure that people are saved and have a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And one of our missions on this show is to preach the gospel of the kingdom to the farthest reaches of the world and to help make disciples of all nations. And it starts with salvation. patriotradio.us/salvation. Believe, receive, become. And this is for everybody. Maybe after Charlie Kirk's assassination, you began to really ask questions and know something was off, and you wanted to find the truth and wanted to be whole. And clearly the world's not providing that truth, and clearly the life that you're living right now is not bringing you to wholeness. So that's what we're here for. Send us a message. We'd love to walk with you into the arms of Jesus. And that brings us to your wisdom from the word for today, from Isaiah 54, verse 15. I think this is a time where we need to look at who is being fiercely attacked. And we're going to talk about what has happened to Pete Hegseth today. And we'll give you the real scoop on how this actually works and the folly that's actually been pointed out in the system that Barack Obama set up to strike people with drones. But Isaiah 54. This is a discernment point. Whoever gets attacked fiercely by the mainstream media, you know they're probably effective. If anyone fiercely attacks you, it will not be from me. This is God talking and writing. Whatever or whoever attacks you will fall because of you. In other words, his love for us is why the enemy's plans and schemes fall. Behold, I myself have created the smith who blows on the fire of coals and produces a weapon for its work. And I have created the destroyer to inflict ruin, the ruin being on the enemy. No weapon that is formed against you or I will succeed, and you will condemn every tongue that accuses you in judgment. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their vindication is from me, declares the Lord. Now, this idea of condemning every tongue, yes, we can actually condemn things. And I hear people, oh, don't judge. No, absolutely. We can judge actions, we can judge words, and we can condemn words, actually, especially words that are false, words that are slanderous, words that are libelous. We can condemn those words, and we can declare the truth of God, the promises of God over ourselves and our family and our community and our nation when those voices come in. And there's a lot of passive Christians today, and really that is an Ahab spirit from the scripture. This passive male that allows in the Jezebel spirit, which is destroying things. And you can always tell by the division that's created and the attempt to destroy people and ministries and callings and businesses. And a lot of people have been talking about this lately across the country, a lot of pastors. What I want to focus on right here is we can condemn the words that come against us in prayer. We can condemn those words and declare the truth. And I think we need to start doing that. And as we pray for our leaders who are being attacked nationally, locally, state level, what have you, as we're praying for those leaders, we can very clearly condemn the words that are lies. And we can speak truth over them, pray for them and their families. That's what we need to be doing in this time, and not shy away from, shrink back from declaring the truth, but also saying that right there, that's wrong. And we can judge it as wrong according to the standard of God. And that brings us now to your daily intelligence briefing. Now, I'm going to be abbreviated today on the intelligence briefing for a couple of reasons. The first is that we need to be talking about color revolutions, and I want to make sure we're educating on what a color revolution is and what that means coming up here in the next weeks and months. So, the first place we're going to go is China. China is deploying a large number of naval and Coast Guard vessels across East Asian waters in what is the largest maritime show of force to date, according to Reuters. Now, while that is true, that they're doing that, it's not like this was unexpected. Actually, China typically does these types of exercises in November and December regularly. That said, this is obviously a show of force against the United States of America and what is happening and the diminishing of Chinese power because of the economic problems that they're going through. And also that people are sick and tired of being bullied by the Chinese. And the Chinese will always call everyone else a bully when they're the ones that have actually been doing it. The first to really stand up against them was the prime minister, the new prime minister of Japan, who has not backed down. And China now has a significant problem. You have large Asian forces arraying against it, the Philippines, China, and obviously Taiwan. South Korea is an issue. And right now in South Korea, the current regime is similar to the Biden regime, persecuting the patriots in South Korea that are anti-communist. And the South Koreans right now can't necessarily be counted on as an ally. However, if the Japanese are against China, that is one piece of calculus that the regime in Beijing cannot ignore. And they understand that if the Japanese, the Philippines, and Taiwan, together with the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, are offering a strong bulwark against China, they very likely will not be able to move against Taiwan. Now, next, this is very fascinating, and I'm just going to talk about the implications of this from the perspective of who they're really after. Now, many of you have heard of this double tap hoax regarding Pete Hegseth. Now, being a 10-year, 2-tour combat veteran, when I hear some of this stuff come out in the mainstream media, it's easily debunked. And what they've made it sound like is Pete Hegseth was sitting in front of a television screen and ordering these strikes. That's not what happened. The Department of War and the whole point behind having the Secretary of War is that when he makes a decision, the generals fulfill it. So Pete Hegseth was not sitting in front of a television screen going, oh, hey, there's two guys clinging on a boat. We're going to hit it again. That's not how this works. He gave the order to the generals then fulfill it. And by the way, the whole targeting sequence goes something like this. They identify potential targets. They have to confirm they're actually legitimate targets. They have to go through a risk assessment regarding the potential for civilian casualties. They have to go through JAG lawyers. Then it has to be approved by commanders. And they do this cycle again. It's not like you just do it one time. They do this cycle again. And so this points out a lot of the folly in this, because there's a lot of targets that could be quickly exploited, but because of the slow process aren't. And this is one of the reasons that the inflexibility in the global war on terror led to an overall loss regarding the information battle space, as well as some of the targeting on the ground, especially Al-Qaeda and ISIS leaders. Now, this has been perfected since then, but it really is some of the folly in the system. When you fight a war, you fight to win. Now, the New York Times debunked the Washington Post article on this exact thing. And so, as we continue to address this, my point is, don't listen to the mainstream media. They're going after Pete Hegseth because if they can take out one of Trump's best cabinet officials, they're going to be able to try to take out Trump again. And obviously, we do not want that to happen. There's a lot of good things that are going on. Now, ABC's Martha Raddatz reported new details on World News Tonight, saying a source claims the two survivors climbed back onto the drug boat after the first hit and were thought to be coordinating with others and recovering narcotics. That assessment led officials to treat them as active combatants, with a JAG officer advising throughout. Raddatz added that the video would be central evidence at Admiral Bradley closed-door questioning on Capitol Hill today. So now you have the information, again, far ahead of most everybody else. All right. Also, I want to bring up that Poland has now banned the Communist Party, finally. Now, a lot of people don't know that after the Cold War, there wasn't actually an attempt by the Polish to get rid of the communists in any concerted effort. And a lot of communists remain in positions that would, I think, make a lot of Americans relate. Communists became judges, lower level political officials in cities and towns. So the fact that they have banned the Communist Party, I would suspect, is going to be a precursor for some investigations in Poland going forward. Now, the other big news today that I want to highlight is the January 6th pipe bomb suspect was identified. The FBI arrested a man named Brian Cole in connection with the January 6th pipe bombs on Thursday morning. Cole is 30 years old, from Woodbridge, Virginia, and according to at least one source that I'm looking at right now, has anarchist or is connected to anarchist ideology. The FBI had information on him for years, but failed to make that connection. And so, obviously, at least at this point, we don't know everything, and the investigation that's going to come out behind this looks like it may be connected to the left again. So, with that said, when we come back from the break, more on what's happening in Mexico and the Middle East.
What if I told you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today.
We're back with your daily intelligence briefing. Next, we're going to move to an interesting development in Russia. A former Russian ground forces chief, Vladimir Churkin, admitted Russia misjudged public support in Ukraine, stating, quote, "We thought 70% of Ukrainians were for us. It turned out to be the opposite," end quote. This is an admission of what we have been talking about here on Patriot Radio for literally years, that the support on the ground in Ukraine was not there for Russia. And in fact, he criticized the country's intelligence services for giving leadership a false picture and underestimating Ukraine. How do we know this? Because Poland is predominantly Catholic, over 90%. Russia is predominantly Eastern Orthodox. Ukraine is the spiritual breadbasket of Europe, the largest Christian country now. Protestant. You saw at the beginning of this conflict, back in 2014, we gave specific examples of how the Russians were coming into Ukraine and shutting down Protestant churches. First person stuff, eyewitnesses, pastors. In fact, now there's even videos of this stuff all over the internet. There was a movie put out by Christian Broadcasting Network that talks about this, a documentary that was played by them that talks about this in Ukraine called Faith Under Siege, I believe. And the Russians continued to shut down Protestant churches and replace them with the Eastern Orthodox Church. These are facts. We've got to deal in facts, not emotion. And what I've seen recently is really poor history and really poor analysis of the facts. The KGB, as a matter of fact, infiltrated the Eastern Orthodox Church and made the church an instrument of the state. The metropolitan, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, is a KGB asset. And so what we're seeing is an organ of the state under the guise of a church, which is what the communists have always done. Back in 1963, in the former Soviet Union, the underground church broke from the state church, the underground church became the confessing church because of the infiltration into the Eastern Orthodox Church and in some of the Protestant churches. And if you talk to the pastors who are still alive, who were in the underground church in the former Soviet Union, they will tell you this. They will tell you about the pastors that compromised. They know them by name. So this idea somehow that Putin is a Christian is ridiculous. What about the video of him recently dedicating with a Quran a mosque? What about the fact he has never renounced his KGB affiliation? What about all of the Soviet defectors who came to this country and said there was a strategy to eventually invade Ukraine 40 years ago? What about the meeting between the Russian military intelligence and the Chinese military intelligence in 1991 and 92 after the wall fell, where they decided and agreed on a strategy to invade the United States using the same strategy Hitler did to invade Norway, which was to send in special forces teams under the guise of businessmen and under the guise of tourists to set the stage, pre-stage weapons, and then eventually take German troops in a cargo ship around the British Navy to invade Norway. And that's exactly what they've been doing, especially under the free immigration policies of President Joe Biden. And then I heard a recent pundit who I respect, Steve Bannon, say that Russia was our true ally in World War II. That is nonsense. There's also a historic work that just recently came out called Stalin's War. Would recommend everybody read that. It gives a completely different take on who actually started World War II. But Stalin was not an ally of the United States of America. As a matter of fact, he infiltrated 329 confirmed Soviet agents into the Roosevelt administration, which became the genesis, the nest egg, if you will, of the deep state. That's literally how the deep state was born. How do we know this? The Matroikin archives, the largest archives smuggled out of the former Soviet Union, the Venona transcripts, the broken Soviet cables that proved this infiltration and who these agents and assets were in the United States of America. And to a large extent now, it is proven that Joseph McCarthy was almost 100% right in who had infiltrated. Now, not again of endorsing methods, but Joseph McCarthy had access to the Venona transcripts. And we haven't even talked about Pavel Sudoplativ. We haven't even talked about the huge defections that came with guys like General Mihai Pachipa, with guys like Yuri Bezmenov, with guys like Anatoly Golitsyn, who clearly laid out the plans coming forward. So when I hear this from a Russian general, we need to take that to heart, that they did misjudge, but it was probably a plan all along, and they were giving their own deception internally to justify what they always wanted to do. That brings us to the Middle East and in Africa, some pretty incredible things happening. First of all, Iran guards warn U.S. vessels during drill in the Gulf. So Iran is starting to flex again in the Middle East. A lot of analysts, and there are a lot of indicators just in general, that Israel is going to strike Iran again soon. The mountain, Pickaxe Mountain facility that we highlighted that was not destroyed in the initial strikes is operational. Not a lot is known about what's going on there. Also, Esfahan. And so it looks like there's going to be strikes against Iran again. Now, it's interesting as well that the Ayatollah came out the other day and said that women are like flowers and need to be nurtured, as there is an increase of rebellion, outright rebellion happening in Iran, where women are taking their burqas off and saying, enough is enough, we've had it. So there is a groundswell now beginning that could lead to an overthrow of that regime in Iran. And I don't think anybody is going to lose sleep over that. Also, in Africa, and just this morning, Trump just finalized another peace deal. That's 8 this year. The latest one is between Congo and Rwanda, who've been fighting for 3 decades. So, this U.S. brokered deal has some significant implications strategically. Let me tell you what those are. Rare earth minerals. There's more, but rare earth minerals. Rwanda and Congo having peace now means that there is a steady supply of rare earth minerals for the United States, again decoupling us from China. Now, recently, an entrepreneur discovered how to convert old computers, hard drives, computer circuit boards, into rare earth minerals. And we have mountains, loads of those. So American ingenuity on the one hand, creative diplomacy on the other, is really undermining the attempt of China at world dominance. Now, also, there was an interesting development, and they call this homeland South Arabia, but really we would know it as southern Yemen. And what happened there is soldiers aligned with the Southern Transitional Council have captured the city of Sayun from the Muslim Brotherhood linked Hadramaut tribe. And I probably mispronounced that. So here's what this tells me is that because Saudi Arabia has influence here, there is an attempt to throw the Muslim Brotherhood out in various regions. This is happening on the ground there in Yemen. And this is going to continue to develop over time. But ultimately, what needs to be addressed is the Muslim Brotherhood operating in Qatar and Turkey. And they have been for a very long time. That brings us now to Mexico. This Friday, President Sheinbaum is going to be in Washington, D.C. to meet with President Trump. Now, President Trump gave Maduro an ultimatum by many reports here a couple of weeks ago. Is he going to do the same with the Mexican president? Now, historically, the United States has had to invade Mexico several times because of terrorism coming across the border and the attacks against the United States of America. The last was in the 19-teens. In fact, General Pershing and then young Lieutenant or Captain Patton, George Patton, was there in Mexico. So this happens every 80 years or 100 years or so. And so this is not out of the norm for the United States to try to bring a correction with our southern neighbor. But the fact is, we're going to talk with our guest today, Trevor Loudon, about this. Mexico has Marxists since AMLO in charge, and that's right on our doorstep. And clearly, Mexico has been used as a conduit to infiltrate communists and jihadis into the United States of America. Which brings us to the color revolution and the whole idea behind the color revolution. There's been several summaries put out. Here's a couple of the best summaries. I want to give a hat tip to Forward Observer and Mike Shelby, who's been on the show before, that have done a fantastic job leading the way on this. Here's the bottom line. It is moving right now from symbolic resistance, if we could bring that pyramid up here. It is moving from symbolic resistance to selective resistance. And next year, they are planning on mass resistance, leading to a popular revolution sometime anywhere from late 2026 into 2028 with the general strike that has been already planned. So when you see selective resistance and then mass resistance, you'll see it says strikes and boycotts, mass disruption. That general strike is one of the key indicators of a color revolution in the offing. Now, these people have publicly chosen a color, yellow. And that's one of the reasons they've chosen the costume Pikachu to do these protests, because Pikachu is, of course, yellow. So let's take a look at what they're going to be doing leading up to the midterm elections. And if we could bring the pre-election conditioning up, they will build civic networks, media. They already have a lot of this. But here's the key point. Through foreign-assisted NGOs, Trump is going after this right now. They're going to try to get foreign observers to come in. They're going to try to make the election seem illegitimate, but they're going to frame this ahead of time. In fact, we're going to know what the headlines are ahead of time. And we did this before the 2020 election, where we literally said what the headlines were going to be. And one of the interesting headlines was regarding generals. So they're going to undermine some of the key institutions in America. We're going to get to that here in just a second. But part of a color revolution is they're going to support, and you're going to see leaders who may shock you begin to call for mass protest, strikes, and civil disobedience. We've already seen this with the 6 leaders who called for the military to start undermining Trump leadership. If we could bring that back up just very quickly. then you're going to see that's what leads us into this international condemnation of what Trump is doing and what Trump's policies are. Then you're going to see defections among police, military, or intelligence. Now, I don't believe that's going to be significantly widespread. There probably are going to be some, and then they're going to try to get Trump to give up. Here's the key point. President Trump, Pete Hegseth, etc., cannot move. They cannot budge one single inch on this stuff. Now, I believe they already understand this, and that's why they're setting up National Guard quick reaction forces across the entire United States, every state, but then some for regions as well. That's exactly right. And you may see President Trump invoke the Insurrection Act because that's exactly what this is. China, Russia, Iran, and the Muslim Brotherhood and their networks are coming against the United States to overthrow the Constitution. And they are using proxies inside the United States that have a political imprimatur, a face of legitimacy. So that brings us to the institutions that, again, they're going to subvert. They're going to subvert the business industry, and they're going to get business owners, business leaders to come out. They're going to co-opt labor. This is already in the offing with this general strike that they're planning for 2028. You're going to see church leaders come out and give some sort of moral authority and moral underpinnings for what they're doing. You're going to see professors, and you're going to see even down to the local level teachers do this as well. You're also going to see this continued rebellion grow inside the civil service corps and inside the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. And then also they're going to try to undermine the military and police, and they have to. So if you are part of the military, you're a veteran, you're law enforcement, you need to understand that anyone asking you to come against President Trump is working for a foreign adversary, unwittingly or wittingly. It really doesn't matter. What matters is we've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. These people want to overthrow it, and we need to stand against it. When we come back from the break, our guest, author, expert on communist infiltration in the United States and what's going on in Venezuela, Trevor Loudon.
What if I told you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today.
And we're back with our guest today, Trevor Loudon. He is an author, but an expert also on the communist infiltration into the United States of America. You can find him at trevorloudon.com, and one of the best resources to research communist networks, organizations, and people, keywiki.org. Trevor, it's great to have you back on Patriot Radio today. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, always a pleasure. Good to see you, Matt. And shout out to the audience.
Well, right now, obviously, on everyone's mind is Venezuela. There is a lot of connections. Venezuela's been used by a lot of nations and intelligence services. If you can kind of give a perspective for everyone, what is actually happening in Venezuela? Who's behind it? And is Maduro really just essentially a puppet?
Yeah, Maduro is just a puppet for the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, Hezbollah, etc. That is a terrorist state down there. And they are exporting terror around Latin America and particularly to the United States. I was talking to a chap the other day who personally, and a friend who personally was part of the Hugo Chavez regime and knew Chavez very well. He said, look, Chavez had a dream of invading America. He wasn't a populist. He was a hardcore communist who wanted to invade and destroy America, okay? Now, Maduro, he wasn't going to invade, but he did a lot of work to destroy us. Also had another friend who was offered by the Venezuelans to start up a terrorist group operating in the swamps of Louisiana in the aftermath of the hurricane down there, you know, the major hurricane in the early 2000s. So Venezuela now is full of Russians, it's full of Chinese, it's full of drugs, it's full of Hezbollah. All of these is a major staging base for operations against the United States, and it's heavily supported by the U.S. communist movement.
So how are they attacking the United States?
Well, they sent when Biden had the borders wide open, they emptied their prisons, they emptied their mental asylums, and they let all their gang members and lunatics come up through the border to the United States. That was deliberate policy, just like the Cubans did back in the 80s with the Mariel boat lift. They emptied their prisons, they emptied their mental hospitals, and flooded us with psychopaths and criminals. That's what they do. They're also obviously involved in the drug trade, and they're also working very closely with, for instance, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. That's the Maoist communist group that did the George Floyd riots and tried to start the anti-ICE riots in Los Angeles recently. They are protesting all over the country right now in defense of Venezuela. They are meeting with Venezuelan diplomats. So Venezuela is, I believe, orchestrating disruption and chaos inside America right now.
How are they connected to the local communist movements in the United States?
Well, directly, Freedom Road Socialist Organization has sent multiple delegations down there recently in the last few years. They've had several meetings with Venezuelan diplomats in Chicago and other centers. Communist Party USA is heavily involved as well. And even Democratic Socialists of America is going down meeting with these people. You know, Venezuela is sort of taken over from Cuba to some degree as the main instigator of violence, street violence and rioting in the United States.
Well, it's been very well known for years that Cuban intelligence has had a pretty heavy hand in Venezuela. If you can describe that longstanding relationship.
Well, look, when there were riots against the Venezuelan government a couple of years ago, and it looked like the government would be toppled, they were beaten down. Demonstrators who were trying to protest against the Maduro government. The cops out in the street, I am told, were mainly Cubans wearing Venezuelan uniforms. That's why I say Maduro's a puppet. The Cubans are in his military, the Cubans are in his police, they're running his secret services, etc. So he is a front group for the Cubans because Venezuela isn't sanctioned as heavily as Cuba is, so it can spread revolution more easily and act as a front group and allow the Cubans, the Russians, and the Chinese to do things that they couldn't do directly.
And the United States hasn't been the only target of Venezuela and in this projection that they're doing from that country, but also other countries in South America. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, they were very, very heavily involved in the last Chilean elections to bring the left to power down in Chile. And that's the case I know most specifically about. But they're also working very closely with Lula da Silva, the communist who now runs Brazil. And I presume they would be involved in several other countries as well. But it's Brazil and Chile that I have the most direct knowledge.
And, you know, it's come up recently regarding election integrity and that Venezuela may have played a role in the 2020 elections, at least against President Trump. What do we know so far regarding that?
Well, I'm not a specialist in that, but I do know that it is pretty well known the Venezuelans under Hugo Chavez, once he got into power, nobody could challenge him because he controlled the elections. You know, it's as Stalin famously said, it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes that counts. So once the communists are in power, they control the elections. And we know that Hugo Chavez developed that to a fine art. We know that Venezuelan companies are connected to some of the the voting machine companies here in the United States. So it's not hard to put it this way, they would have been negligent if they weren't trying to keep the Democrats in power in America. It would have been, the Democrats are very friendly to Hugo Chavez and Maduro, the fellow communists. But they would have been very negligent if they weren't trying to keep Trump or any other Republican out of power. So I think it's very, very likely, knowing the real connections there between Venezuelan companies and American companies and the technology that's been used in Venezuela to hold on to power there, I think it's beyond silly to think that they weren't involved in our elections.
One of my concerns with the opposition movement in any of these countries is that typically communists will set up a false opposition. They will have a controlled opposition. And so is there an actual viable opposition movement in Venezuela that if the United States did pursue regime change, could come to power and could shift the balance of power in South America?
Yeah, I think the current woman leader of the opposition is sound. Guaido, who was touted a few years ago, had a lot of socialist connections, had a socialist background. So I wasn't particularly sad to see him not get, that position. But yes, I think you would find that you could bring in a stable government, a pro-American government into Venezuela. I think there'd be enough people on the ground and enough Venezuelans living here and in other countries who would go back to help that process along. I think it could be done. It is a danger. It is a danger to watch out for, absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think just any country we're talking about this is something that needs to be a consideration always, because we don't want to fall into a trap. When we come back from the break, more with Trevor Loudon, trevorloudon.com, keywiki.org. We're going to talk a little bit about the color revolution that is in the offing here in the United States.
What if I told you could convert your 401k or your IRA into gold? While your retirement is being beat up by a volatile stock market and inflation, it could instead be resting safely in physical gold at a place of your own choosing, including your own business. Look, gold has increased 50% in just the last year. Stock market, it's been nothing but a roller coaster. So protect your retirement from market chaos by calling Verity Metals today.
And we're back with our guest, Trevor Loudon. He is an expert on the infiltration of communists and communism into the Western Hemisphere, and particularly America. TrevorLoudon.com, keywiki.org. Trevor, as we were talking about before the break regarding Venezuela, we see Trump, I think, giving a clear ultimatum to Maduro to leave power. But obviously, there's a whole bunch of interests that do not want him to leave. I don't see how this ends with him just kind of walking out of power, because communists never really do that. How do you see this going forward in the next 60 days?
Yeah, this is my worry. I think the Russians and the Chinese may pull out in exchange for a secret deal to sell Ukraine out to the Russians. That's what I'm worried about. I'm very worried about that. I hope that's not in the offing. But look, I think the writing is on the wall for Maduro. I think there may have to be kinetic stuff, but I see a little bit of American destabilization and a clear resolve by the United States. I think you'll bring people out on the streets in Venezuela to do the job themselves. I think this can be done. I'm just worried what side deals might go with it. That's all.
Well, in addition to that, Mexico seems to be on the table as well. He's used very veiled language, President Trump. Regards to Mexico, the Mexican president is going to be at the White House later this week. Obviously, the cartels are not just limited to Venezuela. How does it look? And she's a Marxist as well by all of
Scheinbaum is a Marxist, absolutely. As was her predecessor, AMLO. He was also a Marxist. We've got a communist-led government on the Rio Grande. We got to understand that.
Yeah, so this is what I'm talking about. What does that look like? Because they've been hiding successfully behind the cartels. The cartels have been doing all this. They say they're fighting, and they're never really effective in doing it because they're on the same side. So how does this look for the United States going forward, and what would be your counsel to President Trump?
I'd say go forward, President Trump. Look, America is doomed if we do not deal with the red tide in our very backyard. It's the drugs, it's the political corruption, it's everything that goes with it. It's strategic weapons being placed in Venezuela. They're already there. Weapons in Nicaragua, Russian weapons in Nicaragua that can reach the United States, and of course, Cuba. So President Trump, I think, is the first president in a long time who's going to apply the Monroe Doctrine, meaning foreign powers will not be in our hemisphere. And I think that's great. I think absolutely take down Maduro. I think that will encourage the freedom forces all over Latin America. I think will encourage the freedom forces in Mexico and Cuba. Keep the sanctions on Cuba. Take them down one after another. And you don't have to use a lot of force to do it. Use economic power. And just the fact that America is standing with the freedom forces of Latin America, I think will be enough to tip the balance in many countries. They call it the pink tide, the communists call it the pink tide that has taken over most of Latin America in the last 30 years. Yeah, well, they call it the pink tide. The communists call it the pink tide. Almost all of Latin America, with the exception of El Salvador and Argentina and a couple of other countries, is now controlled by Marxists, though Chile may slip out of their grip fairly soon too. And so it's a real battle down there. And the Monroe Doctrine always said, the Western Hemisphere is America's sphere of influence. We don't want Russians here. We don't want Chinese here. We don't want any European power interfering down there. And full marks to President Trump for trying to put that into effect. And so I fully support what he's doing in Venezuela. But then the argument's over tactics. It doesn't mean I would endorse everything that happens, but the general thrust, I'm very much supportive.
Well, and I think the overall trajectory, I don't know what happened a couple of weeks ago, but it seems like there was a massive shift with President Trump regarding the forces that have been attacking the United States, and particularly Islam. And we've seen a huge shift in that regard.
Yeah.
Much to the chagrin of the left, but to our great cheer that finally
Absolutely.
The Muslim Brotherhood is on the table as a terrorist organization. So, how does this translate to, okay, if we're recognizing that there's foreign terrorist organizations trying to take down the United States, that begs the question, well, what about China? And I know he's trying to walk a fine line there. The fact is that Chinese and Russian intelligence services have been running amok in America for decades.
Look, they have. I wrote in my book, Stealth, Kamala Harris's Communist Roots. The Chinese gave us Obama, the Chinese gave us Kamala Harris, the Chinese gave us Biden, and they gave us Tim Walz. That's how much power they have in America. That's how much power they have right now. The Russians also have lots of power. They have people in both parties who are working for them. The Putin Republicans are a classic example of that. And so, yes, this is the first step. We're going after low-hanging fruit here, where, the Muslim Brotherhood should be pretty darn obvious. Taking down the Venezuelans is going to be the Venezuelan communists, not taking down Venezuela, taking out the Venezuelan communists to liberate that country. But we cannot take our eye off the ball that the Chinese and their Russian comrades are the biggest problem. And I'll put Iran in there as well. So, but by going after these low-level fruits and investigating the Muslim Brotherhood, that's going to lead back to China and Russia and Iran. That's going to open the door to all of that. So once you get into that can of worms, it goes pretty deep. So let's hope this is the first step in a really comprehensive cleansing of the American system, because we will not survive if that does not happen.
There's no question that over the years, the United States has been the number one target of the communists, the number one target of the jihadis. And so now on the 250th anniversary of the birth of America, this color revolution is kicking off. They've chosen a color, publicly yellow, which I actually think is fairly hilarious. That makes it easy to mock, and we should not be silent about that. We should mock it. But what does this look like unfolding? Unrest clearly is being talked about by the left. They're setting up a general strike, which is one of the key indicators of a color revolution for 2028. What does this look like between right now and into 2026?
Yo, you're right. And when we talk about a color revolution, and that's what's happening, but we've got to understand this is not being done by the CIA or the FBI. This is being done by the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Cubans, the Muslim Brotherhood, and a whole host of other, hostile countries. So, we've got bad actors in America cooperating with this, but this is an overseas operation. Well, it's going to be massive lawfare. It's going to be terrorist activities on our streets. I think we're going to see significant kinetic Muslim attacks and Maoist attacks. Black Lives Matter was a Maoist Chinese operation. That's all going to amp up. The goal is going to be to disrupt the elections as much as possible and make Trump just fight battles every day. And he's getting ready for the battles coming in America by taking out Venezuela, the Venezuelan government. That's going to help fight the battles in America because they're a major instigator of that. It'll take the Chinese and the Russians out of Venezuela as well, which will be another help. So I think the stage is being set here. The president knows we're going to have kinetic stuff on our soil, massive lawfare. As you say, general strikes are being planned. George Floyd will be like the George Floyd riots will be like a Boy Scout jamboree compared to what they could try and do. And so Americans have to be prepared for this. We have to understand that the country's under major attack. The enemies of America understand that if President Trump wins the midterms and he has a decent successor, their plans crumble.
Yeah.
Their 50 years of subversion in this country start to fall apart. And they're putting everything into this. They have to take him down. They have to take him down. So nothing is off the table. Nothing. But the president's got to be very aggressive with this. I proposed plans of what he should do. He needs to set up a new agency going after foreign infiltrators in this country. He needs to even offer amnesty to traitors. If they'll come forward and telling us what they're doing, they won't get prosecuted. Treat it like the mafia. Get low-level guys, offer them a way out if they'll rat on the people above them. And you could clean this out pretty quickly if you applied those kind of technologies. But I think he's setting the stage for this.
Rico. I completely agree.
Rico, yeah, 100%. RICO was set up to counter the mafia, but the same techniques could be used against the Muslim Brotherhood, against the Venezuelan, the Russian, the Chinese networks, and also against the big vote fraud operations as well. You can't clean up the vote fraud in Chicago from Illinois. You have to do federal RICO lawsuits, catch low-level vote fraudsters, offer them a deal if they'll rat on the people above them. And if they will, then you offer the next level up, and you could take these organizations down. And you'd only have to jail a few people, but it would serve as an example for all the others. These problems are confrontable and handleable with the political will. And President Trump's one of the only presidents we've had in recent years since Reagan who's had a considerable degree of political will. His very survival, physical, his family survival, and his legacy and America all depend on how effective he is over the next couple of years at dealing with these internal and external threats who want to bring this country down.
Now, I don't want patriots watching and listening today to think that, there's a plan, we're just going to trust the plan and sit on the sidelines, because that's actually another active measure that has come against the United States.
QAnon was a Russian active measure to take people out of politics. Don't worry, there's a plan. Don't worry, trust the plan. Well, there was no plan, This was modeled on the trust, the Russian operation of the 1920s. When America and Japan and Britain were trying to take down communism in Russia, we heard all the stories about, don't worry, there's a plan. there's a secret group in Russia that's going to take down the Communist Party. And so the Americans and the British thought, oh, well, we don't have to worry. They pulled out. And then the Russian intelligence services told them, it was a scam after all. We were in control of it. We controlled the whole lot. Bad luck.
Yeah.
This is, look, this is a God thing here. This is God's ordained country. And every single one of us has a God-given. We were put in America with all this wealth and privilege for a reason. Every single one of us has a responsibility to defend this country. Every one of us. And we don't leave it to our leaders. George Washington couldn't have won without all the farmers and blacksmiths and fishermen who joined his army. And we're not going to save this country unless every patriot who can gets involved in this, because God is looking at this country, and if enough people stand up, things will happen that we might not expect. But God doesn't help losers. God doesn't help cowards. God doesn't help whingers and freeloaders. God helps people who are serious about honoring him by saving the country he gave us. That's the real message here.
Well said. Trevor Loudon, as always, thank you. A fantastic discussion. Blessings to you. Merry Christmas, and keep up the fight.
Thank you, sir. Let's have a great new year. There's going to be some battles. We got to be in there.
Amen. TrevorLoudon.com, keywiki.org. And what you can do locally, practically, maybe you're a county auditor. Maybe you're a county assessor. Maybe you're somebody that just knows where the Chinese have been buying up property near military bases, and it's you that is going to blow the whistle on it. Maybe you're the person who knows about the criminal activity that could be the key to taking down a terrorist network. Now is the time to stand up and be courageous. Now is the time to meet with your local prosecutors and county sheriffs. Ask them what they're doing to address these threats to the United States of America, or even if they understand these threats. Don't wait for someone else to do it. Maybe God put you here exactly for such a time as this. This is Matt Shea. Thank you for joining me on Patriot Radio. May God bless all of you. He is making this generation the greatest one, so keep up the fight.